welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, today we have with us a medical doctor, Anthony Levatino, who's a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist. In the pro-life movement, he's gone from one end of the spectrum to the other. Early on in his career, he was an abortionist, and now in this day and age, he's a pro-life advocate. And we're going to ask him today how he first got into the abortion business of being an abortionist, and then how he became a pro-life advocate. Well, welcome, Dr. Levatino.
Thank you.
Dr. Levatino, back in the late 70s, you were in medical school. Could you tell us how you got involved with doing abortions and where you came about? I know you were up here in Massachusetts several months ago and relayed much of your story. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I graduated from medical school in 1976 and started my OB training in 1977. And at the time, if you asked me how I felt about the abortion issue, I would have not hesitated to tell you I was pro-choice. This was a decision between a woman, her doctor, and frankly, no one, including the baby's father, had anything else to say about it. You know, some people identify themselves as pro-life or pro-choice, but for a lot of folks, it doesn't really affect their lives in any number of ways, including how they vote. But when you're an obstetrician gynecologist, or you're training to be one, and you say that you're pro-choice, now you have to choose whether you're going to actually do abortions or not. So along with learning how to do deliveries and hysterectomies and all the things that obstetrician gynecologists do, I learned to do abortions. We did first trimester abortions. They were suction D&C abortions up to about 12 or 13 weeks. And we did those in the delivery room, believe it or not. And when it was my turn to do them, I would do 2, 3, 4 in the morning, never think anything of it. If they were more than 13 weeks at the time, we would bring them back several weeks later for saline abortions. These aren't done anymore, but suffice it to say that these women had to go through labor, and it would typically take them 8 to 36 hours to deliver their usually dead children. It's a gruesome business, but you get used to anything. And so along with learning to do all the other procedures, I learned to do abortions. Once I got out of medical school, I traveled, I worked for a year in western Florida, didn't decide to stay, and left after a year, went back to upstate New York and set up practice with a physician that I had trained with. Bill and I were practiced abortionists. We were running in a normal OBGYN office. We weren't just doing abortions by any stretch. We did all the normal things that obstetrician gynecologists do. But abortion was a part of our practice. And at that time in the early 80s, those of us in the abortion industry were looking for a better method of second trimester abortion, the late-term abortions. Salines were difficult, expensive. Women had to spend days in the hospital. It was incredibly difficult on the patients, and it was also difficult on staff. We wanted a method of late-term abortion that was like suction D&C. A patient could go to sleep, and when she woke up, it was all over. And that's when second trimester D&E abortions were performed. And these were done on babies up to 24 weeks of gestation. Very few physicians would do these kind of abortions. We saw an opportunity, so we trained ourselves to do these late-term abortions, and we did them on referral with our own patients and other patients. And over the next 4 years, I did 1,200 abortions, including over 100 late-term abortions up to 24 weeks.
Mm-hmm. And then you and your wife was in the medical business too, wasn't she, or was she?
She was a specialist duty nurse who was doing renal transplants, and that was back when renal transplantation was new, and she was one of the earliest people in that industry to ever get trained. We met each other in 1976, found out that we were on opposite sides of the issue when we started dating, and made the foolish mistake of not discussing it or working it out. We got married about a year later, attempted to have a family of our own, and found out that we had an infertility problem. So after a rather lengthy infertility evaluation, the physician who was taking care of her said that there was one more procedure he could try that should only take an hour and a half. Well, when he walked out of the operating room 4.5 hours later, he told me that it was very unlikely we were going to have a child of our own. This was important to us, And since we realized we probably weren't going to have a child of our own, we decided to adopt a child. And anybody in the audience who's tried to adopt a child knows how difficult that is. We called state agencies, county agencies, religious agencies, anyone we could think of. And the best we could do after months of effort was get on a 5-year waiting list to get on the real waiting list. It was then that I had an idea, and we discussed it and went ahead and implemented it. And I said, this is ridiculous. I mean, I know 50 obstetricians on a first-name basis in this town. Why don't we just advertise? Maybe we'll get lucky and would, be able to get a private adoption, and that's exactly what we did.
I understand that a nurse had passed you a piece of paper while you were performing abortions, saying to call.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't performing an abortion. That was you heard the story a little off.
Okay.
Well, what happened was we did start advertising to tell people that we were looking for a baby to adopt, and it was in August of 1978. I was performing a hysterectomy, I think, just in the operating room with one of the attending physicians, when I got tapped on the shoulder by the circulating nurse and turned around, and she's holding a piece of paper that said, "Call Marcia as soon as you were done." Now, Marcia was the head of social services at Albany Medical Center, where I worked in Albany, New York, and it's all the message said, but I knew what it was, and sure enough, she informed me when I called her ultimately that there was a 15-year-old girl in labor in the delivery room. She'd received no prenatal care of any kind, but now she was in labor. Everything seemed to be going well. The baby appeared healthy. She wants to give her baby up for adoption. Are you interested? Well, of course we were interested. And literally by the grace of God, we were able to adopt a little girl that we named Heather in August of 1978. As sometimes happens, after all the years and after all the tears and after all the uncertainty, now we had a daughter, and my wife got pregnant the very next month, and we ended up with a son, Sean, who was born in July 1979, barely 10 months after Heather was born.
Irish twins.
Irish twins. And we had a son and a daughter. It was during the time when we were trying to adopt a child that I had my first selfish doubts about abortion, knowing that it was abortions that were making the adoption side of things so difficult. But, of course, now I had a family of my own, and any doubts we had simply erased, and I went back to business as usual.
And then you were doing first and second trimesters at that time, and then in reading a little bit about what went on, and from what you told us earlier this year in Medway, Massachusetts, at Britannia, which was a huge turnout of folks. What happened then?
Well, the practice was growing, the kids were growing, and I was finally making some money, and everything was going along just fine. But on June 23rd, 1984, as Heather was exactly 2 months away from her 6th birthday, Sean was just a few days away from his 5th birthday, and it was a Saturday. It was a beautiful day in Albany. I was on call, but it wasn't too busy. I made rounds and then got to spend the rest of the day with my family. We took the kids to an amusement park. We had dinner together that evening, and the kids were playing in the backyard that evening when we had friends come over for cake and coffee. And we were talking with our friends when at 7:25 that night we heard the screech of brakes out in front of our house. We found out that our kids were trying to cross the street, and Heather had been hit by a car. She was a mess. And I tell people, I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be able to save people's lives. My wife was an intensive care nurse. We did everything we could, but she literally died in our arms in the back of an ambulance that night.
Wow, that's really something. And that experience, did that change you also?
I didn't think at first it did, but what do you do after a disaster? You take a couple of weeks off, you bury your child, and then you go, you try to get back in your life. When I speak in front of groups like the group in Massachusetts, and I'm not going to do it here on a television program, but I usually start off the talk by describing in detail a second trimester D&E abortion. This is all firsthand. And in a second trimester D&E abortion, I talk about having a 17-year-old patient with a baby who's 20 weeks pregnant. And if your audience wants to know how big a 20-week pregnancy is, a 20-week baby is the length of your hand from the tip of your middle finger to your wrist. That's head to rump, not counting the legs. and this patient's been feeling her baby kick for the last week or two. But when you do an abortion on a baby that size, what you're doing is literally tearing that child apart, limb from limb, literally. Ripping out arms, ripping out the legs, ripping out the intestines and the spine and the heart and lungs, and then crushing this, the skull and pulling pieces out. It's not pretty. But I describe that in detail so that people understand what this is, why it's so important, and why I feel the way I do. I don't know how long it was after Heather died, but I showed up at OR number 9 at Albany Medical Center just like I had over 100 times before for a late-term abortion. And I wasn't thinking of this as anything special. I obviously had other things on my mind. And I started that abortion like I'd done so many times before and literally ripped out an arm or a leg. And I just stared at it in the clamp and got sick. Just a minute ago, I talked about pulling out body parts. When you do an abortion, you have to keep inventory. You have to make sure that you get 2 arms, 2 legs, and all the pieces. Because if you don't, your patient's going to come back infected, bleeding, or dead. So I finished that abortion. And I know it sounds strange to people, but I always promise people that everything I'm saying is firsthand and true. For the first time, and after all those years and all those abortions, I really looked at that pile of body parts on the side of the table. And I didn't see her wonderful right to choose, and I didn't see what a great doctor I was helping her with her problem, and I didn't even see the $800 cash I just made in 15 minutes. All I could see was somebody's son or daughter. And it occurred to me in that moment that this patient had come to me figuratively, never literally, but figuratively had come to me and said, here's my $800, kill my son or daughter. And I was the kind of physician that would be, without any compunction whatsoever, would look her right back in the face and say, sure, well, I'll do that. No problem.
And this all changed. I had to ask a couple of questions regarding an abortion. What's the difference in a saline abortion and pulling a baby apart, number one? And number two, when you do a D&E abortion, are you able to see anything, or you kind of blindly go in with the instruments?
Yeah, the D&E abortion is a totally blind procedure. You can't see anything. You do everything by feel. And that's why, when you reach in, there's a clamp that we use called a Sofer clamp. It's a big, heavy clamp. It's about 13 inches long, stainless steel. And the business end has rows of sharp teeth. So when it gets a hold of something, it doesn't let go. And you use that to literally pull the baby to pieces. But that's why you have to keep track of all the pieces and make sure you get everything. The saline abortion, as I said, haven't been done in many years now, but those are intact. You would do an amniocentesis, put a needle through the uterine wall, draw out as much of the protective amniotic fluid as you could, and substitute 20% salt solution. That would burn the baby, usually kill the baby, and initiate labor. It's a dangerous procedure, and as I said, it's not only dangerous, but it's difficult, and it takes a long time to accomplish. It's very expensive as a result. It had a lot of very undesirable qualities about it, which is why we abandoned it years ago in favor of D&E abortions once it was learned how to do them.
Mm-hmm. And you've and then when did you inform, or when did you decide that you were getting out of the abortion business, and how did your associate take that? And did you have to leave one community of doctors and go to another? Or how did that all work? Well,
I kept on doing abortions for a while, but I was feeling increasingly uncomfortable with it. And really, and my wife and I finally, after a few months after Heather died, see, the problem with not talking about one important issue is when a married couple, start not talking about other important issues, and we were drifting apart. We had a knockdown drag-out several months after Heather died, mainly about the whole abortion issue. And she knew I was feeling bad, and we were, and she finally basically said, look, if you're feeling so bad, why don't you just quit? I went back to my partners the next day and told them I would no longer do any more of these late-term second trimester abortions. I would just do the early ones, up to 10 weeks we were doing in the office as Section D and Cs. I know that people think that doctors are so smart, but once you figure out in your heart and not your head that killing a baby the size of your hand is wrong, for money, then it doesn't take you too long to figure out that it doesn't matter how big the baby is. It's all the same. You want to see what an unborn baby at 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 weeks looks like, just get an ultrasound. You can see them on the internet or anywhere else, and you will see a totally formed human being, but jumping around in the uterus, moving arms and legs, a heart beating. That is your son or daughter. I tell groups when I speak to them, don't get into arguments about fetus versus baby. They're just different terms for the same thing. Or embryo, or blastocyst, or all the technical terms you can use. The fact of the matter is all of those terms describe one thing, your son or your daughter. And I think that puts it in perspective, because that's what this is about.
Now, I had on this show, before she passed away, the lady Doe of Doe versus Bolton, and Sandra Cano is her name. And in that, she always had felt that, and she tried to overturn her own case, was unsuccessful, unfortunately, but she always felt that she was going to be labeled as she was the person that brought abortion all the way up to the day of birth, and that an abortion for any reason whatsoever. And you often hear the other side say that, well, we have to protect the mother's health. And how often do you really have to protect the mother's health? You're in that field. Is that really a valid criticism?
There's a lot of people that get confused about this. It's funny, I was having a discussion with a physician just last week about it. When you have an ectopic or a tubal pregnancy, that pregnancy has either already died or is going to die, and that mother is going to die. You treat that woman immediately and promptly to save her life. Those come up occasionally, but that's very early in pregnancy. There are situations where pregnancy can be very dangerous to the life of the mother. Out-of-control diabetes, severe heart disease, cancers, toxemia that your audience is certainly familiar with, where blood pressures get very high. Mm-hmm. But the idea, and there's two things about that you have to realize, though. Those kind of severe problems in pregnancy virtually always occur late in the second trimester, mid to late second trimester or third trimester, where the babies are considerably well developed, and very often can live outside the womb without any difficulty. I give a perfect example. Oh, and there's another thing you need to understand about late-term suction D&E abortion, or the other techniques that are used in even later abortions. It takes several days to prepare the cervix, to open it widely enough to do the procedure. It can take anywhere from 2 to 3 days to prepare the cervix to do a late-term abortion. It's just the anatomy and physiology. There's no way around it. So here's a real-life example. I had a patient come into my hospital when I was on call one night. She was 27 weeks pregnant, 13 weeks premature. Her baby doesn't even barely weigh 2 pounds. And her blood pressure, her normal blood pressure, is 120 over 80. Mm-hmm. Her blood pressure was 220 over 160.
Wow.
She was easily minutes or hours away from a stroke, amongst other things that could possibly happen to her. The only way you can cure toxemia is to end the pregnancy, to terminate the pregnancy. Now, I hate, in a way, the word termination's been stolen. And what I mean by terminate the pregnancy in this case is end the pregnancy. Make her unpregnant as fast as you can. Well, it was simple enough. We stabilize her, do a cesarean section. Within an hour, her baby's born and being taken care of by the neonatologists who take care of these extremely premature kids. Once she's delivered, her blood pressure drops, and in days we know that she and the baby are doing just fine, and she and that baby did just fine. Now imagine in that situation you don't want to do a delivery, you want to do an abortion instead. When you have a patient with a blood pressure of 220 over 160, you don't have 2 or 3 days to decide what to do or to prepare the uterus so that you can terminate the pregnancy. That woman would be dead in 2 or 3 days. In terms of late-term abortion, to literally and seriously save women's lives in cases of serious pregnancy problems, abortion is worthless. I worked in a high-risk tertiary referral center in Albany, New York for 10 years, taking care of hundreds and hundreds of women with these kind of severe problems. And of the hundreds of times that I had to end pregnancies by delivery to save women's lives, I never had to deliberately kill a single child. Abortion is worthless for saving women's lives when you have truly serious pregnancy problems like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, a growing area of abortion that Planned Parenthood is really pushing hard is medical abortions. What's your opinion of medical, or sometimes it's called chemical abortions? What's your thoughts on that?
Medical abortions are getting more popular because it's easy to do. When you're doing a surgical abortion, a suction DNC, or especially a suction D&E, you better be very well trained, and you better be prepared to take care of the complications that can occur. I don't want to make your audience sick, but I had during one of those D&E late-term abortions, I reached in with the clamp, and instead of pulling out an arm or a leg, I pulled out the lady's intestines. So you've got to be in a place where you can take care of emergencies immediately. In early pregnancy, you can just do these medical abortions. Just take a pill, followed by a second medication roughly 24 to 48 hours later, and you will 9 times out of 10 or a little better, you will abort your pregnancy. You induce a miscarriage at home. Now, there are people that advocate this because it's more private. You're not in some abortion clinic. But on the other hand, there are complications and problems that can occur with chemical or medical abortions as well. But the most serious one, and one that has to be guarded against, is if I do a suction DNC abortion, I put an instrument in there, suck out the baby parts and everything else. That gets sent off to a pathologist, and it gets looked at, and he sends me back a report and assures me that, yes, there are fetal parts here, there are body parts here in the specimen, so I know I got the abortion. I completed the abortion. I actually got the pregnancy the way I intended. But if you do a chemical abortion and a woman has a miscarriage, she starts having cramping, nausea, sometimes bleeding, sometimes heavy bleeding, and more often than not ends up on a toilet. And then what's her first compunction when this mass of tissue is dropped into the toilet? Well, she reaches for the flush knob and off it goes. Now you don't have any tissue that gets examined. The danger here is that if she has an undiagnosed ectopic or tubal pregnancy, you won't know it. And then she thinks, oh, okay, my abortion's done, I'm all set, I'm safe. And then that ectopic pregnancy continues to grow in her tube and may ultimately rupture and can cause severe injury to the mother, even death of the mother. You must absolutely positively rule out ectopic pregnancy before you do a medical abortion. That's important. And the only way I know of ruling out an ectopic pregnancy in a situation where you're going to do a chemical abortion is to do an ultrasound. And yet, doctors sometimes prescribe RU46 or Mifeprex without doing an ultrasound, without ruling out an ectopic pregnancy. And now we're talking about so-called telemedicine or telephone abortions, where the patient doesn't even see the doctor, and no problem. We're just going to hand out those pills. And women have died from undiagnosed ectopic pregnancy with chemical abortion, and they will continue to do so long as doctors do not follow proper protocol and rule out ectopic pregnancy prior to performing them before administering the medication.
Can I ask 2 quick questions as our time is coming to a close? One is, it appears that the 7-day limit on those abortion pills has been pushed back, so they're trying to push it out to 14 days.
Actually, it used to be 7 weeks. Now it's been increased to 10 weeks.
Oh, okay. And then abortion pill reversal, what do you think of that?
Well, the way that RU46 works is by interfering with progesterone. Progesterone is a hormone made by the ovaries that keeps the pregnancy intact and in place in the uterus. If you interfere with progesterone, the tissues break down and you get a miscarriage. That's how it works. So there is research now that's starting to be done, and trials are starting to be held, where occasional cases where a woman takes the RU46 and then changes her mind. Now, if you don't take the second follow-up drug and you change your mind after taking Mifeprex, you'll still miscarry in roughly 50 to 60% of cases. If you give progesterone, which is what the RU46 is trying to counteract, by giving large doses of progesterone, you may counteract the RU46 and actually allow the pregnancy to stay intact. There is more research is needed in this area, but it's an area that can save some lives when women who have made their own choice have now made the opposite choice and want to save their baby. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. It's an area where more research is needed.
I see. Lastly, and this is the last question, you had mentioned a story about a lady that was out protesting in front of a clinic or something and came in as a patient of yours. How did she affect you?
I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of that story, other than to say, for people who feel strongly about abortion, sometimes they'll pick it outside of Planned Parenthood. There's nothing wrong with that. Or pick it outside of a doctor's office. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to really change someone's mind, you're never going to change an abortionist's mind by standing outside of his office and yelling murderer. That's just not how it works. If you want to change someone's mind about anything, you need to develop some kind of relationship with them. Now, this particular woman happened to be one of my patients who was picketing my office. I didn't even know she was out there. She decided to become a patient. And by becoming a patient, that allowed her to talk to me about the whole abortion thing and why she felt that this wasn't a very good idea. So if you want to change anyone's mind about an issue, you must develop a relationship with them, and that allows you and gives you access to them to talk to them. And one way to do that is to become an abortionist patient and talk to them that way.
Very good. Well, Dr. Levatino, thank you very much for coming on the show today, and I know you've got a very busy schedule. And we really appreciate you being a pro-life advocate this day and explaining to folks what really goes on. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.
Yep. We hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.